Picture this. You are at an airport, not your home airport where everything is familiar and you move through it on autopilot, but a foreign one in a country whose language you do not speak, and your phone battery has died, and the gate has changed, and you need to find a specific terminal, and none of the signs make any immediate sense, and every person you approach responds to your increasingly desperate English with a polite but firm look of incomprehension. You are stranded inside language. Not outside a country, not outside a building, but outside the one thing that makes human coordination possible between strangers: shared sound and meaning. And it takes about 4 minutes of that experience to understand, viscerally and personally, just how catastrophically dependent human beings are on the ability to communicate with each other in the same code. Now scale that up. Not one confused traveler in one airport, but all of humanity spread across the planet, developing in isolation from each other over tens of thousands of years, each group building their own system of sounds and meanings and grammar from scratch. The result is what we have today. Somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 languages currently spoken on Earth, each one a complete, complex, self-contained system for encoding and transmitting human thought, each one different enough from most of the others that speakers of one cannot understand speakers of another without dedicated study. How did that happen? Were we always like this, divided by language into thousands of separate communicating communities? Or was there a time, somewhere in the deep past, when all humans shared a single tongue? Did one original human language exist from which every language alive today descended, the way every human descended from common ancestors in Africa? This is one of the oldest questions in the study of language, one of the most contested, and one of the most fascinating. The answer sits at the intersection of linguistics, genetics, archaeology, cognitive science, and some extraordinary detective work that has been ongoing for centuries and is still producing surprising results. Start with what we actually know about how languages change over time, because understanding language change is the foundation for understanding whether a single ancestral language is possible. Languages are not static. They change continuously in every generation through processes that linguists understand reasonably well. Sounds shift gradually in predictable patterns. New words are coined, and old words change meaning. Grammatical structures simplify or complexify in response to patterns of use and contact with other languages. When populations speaking the same language become geographically separated, the two groups diverge over generations, their respective versions of the language accumulating changes independently until the two groups can no longer understand each other. At that point, one language has become two. This process is called linguistic divergence, and it has produced the language diversity of the modern world from what were once smaller numbers of ancestral languages. Linguists have been working backward through this process for centuries, grouping languages into families based on shared features that indicate common descent, tracing those families back to reconstructed ancestral languages, and building family trees of linguistic relationship that are in many ways analogous to the family trees of biological species. The Indo-European language family is the best-known example. English, German, French, Spanish, Italian, Russian, Hindi, Farsi, Greek, and dozens of other languages all descend from a single ancestral language called proto-Indo-European, which was spoken somewhere in the Eurasian steppe region roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. Nobody wrote Proto-Indo-European down. No recording of it exists. But linguists have reconstructed significant portions of it by applying the comparative method, systematically comparing the sounds and words of all the descendant languages, identifying the regular patterns of sound change that connect them, and working backward through those patterns to the ancestral forms. The reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European is one of the great achievements of 19th and 20th century scholarship. It produced a language that nobody has ever heard but that linguists can speak to a limited degree, that can be partially translated, and whose vocabulary tells us things about the culture and environment of the people who spoke it. They had words for horses and wheels and cattle and agriculture, which tells us something about when and where they lived. They had a word for the sky deity that appears in cognate forms across Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and Germanic languages. They had words for concepts that their descendants would carry across half the world. The same comparative method has been applied to other language families. Sino-Tibetan, Afro-Asiatic, Niger-Congo, Austronesian, Dravidian, and many others. Each family has been traced back to a reconstructed proto-language. Each of those proto-languages represents a real ancestral tongue spoken by real people at a specific time and place, even if we can only partially reconstruct what it sounded like. The question of the single original language is, at its core, the question of whether all of these proto-languages descended from a single, even earlier ancestor, and whether that ancestor can be traced. The proposal that all human languages descend from a single ancestral language has a formal name, the proto-human or proto-world hypothesis. It has serious scientific proponents and equally serious scientific critics, and the debate between them illuminates both the possibilities and the limits of linguistic reconstruction. The strongest version of the argument goes like this. All humans descend from populations that lived in Africa. Genetic evidence places the origin of our species there around 300,000 years ago, and the linguistic capacity that makes language possible is a biological feature of the human species that presumably arose once in a single ancestral population. If language evolved once in one population, then the first language was spoken by that population, and all subsequent languages descend from it. The logic is straightforward. The question is whether we can find any evidence of that common origin surviving in modern languages after hundreds of thousands of years of divergence. Joseph Greenberg, one of the most influential linguists of the 20th century, spent much of his career attempting to group the world's languages into a smaller number of larger families than were conventionally recognized. His methods were controversial among specialists, but his ambition to trace deeper linguistic relationships was taken seriously enough to generate sustained engagement. Other researchers, notably Merritt Rulin, extended this work into the search for proto-world vocabulary, attempting to identify words or word roots that appear in enough of the world's language families to suggest descent from a common ancestral form. The proposed proto-world words that have attracted most attention are basic vocabulary items, terms for mother, finger, water, what, and a handful of others that appear in superficially similar forms across geographically distant language families. The argument is that these similarities are too widespread to be coincidental, that they represent traces of an original vocabulary surviving across tens of thousands of years of language change. The criticism from mainstream historical linguistics is pointed and well developed. Languages change at rates that make reconstruction beyond a certain time depth essentially impossible. The standard estimate is that beyond roughly 8,000 to 10,000 years, linguistic change accumulates to the point where evidence of common ancestry becomes indistinguishable from chance similarity. The words proposed as proto-world vocabulary, critics argue, are either chance resemblances between unrelated languages, the result of similar sound meaning associations that arise independently in multiple languages, or artifacts of the selection bias inherent in searching for similarities across thousands of languages. The argument about chance similarity is worth unpacking because it is more substantial than it might appear. With thousands of languages, each containing thousands of words, the probability of finding superficially similar forms for any given meaning is quite high even with no historical relationship. If you look hard enough across a large enough sample of languages for words that sound like water that mean water, you will find some. The question is whether what you find exceeds what chance predicts, and demonstrating that rigorously across the full linguistic sample is extremely difficult. Here is where genetics enters the conversation and changes the shape of the question in ways that are still being worked through. The genetic history of modern humans, reconstructed from analysis of DNA from living populations and from ancient DNA extracted from archaeological remains, has become extraordinarily detailed in the last 2 decades. It reveals a picture of human population history that has direct implications for the question of language origins. The genetic evidence for a population bottleneck in African human history, a period when the ancestral population of all modern humans was dramatically smaller than it is today, has specific implications for language diversity. All humans outside Africa carry genetic signatures consistent with descent from a relatively small ancestral population that expanded out of Africa. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Roughly 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. The languages of these out-of-Africa descendants, whatever they were when the migration began, would have subsequently diversified into the non-African language families of today. The language families of sub-Saharan Africa, particularly the Khoisan languages spoken by the San people and related groups, are among the most linguistically diverse and complex on Earth. The Khoisan languages include click consonants that are used in no other language families in the world except those that show evidence of historical contact with Khoisan speakers. The click phonemes are not a simple feature. They are complex, requiring precise tongue and airflow control, and they appear in multiple distinct forms that function as separate consonants within the Khoisan languages. Some linguists have proposed that click sounds represent a very ancient feature of human language preserved in the populations that have been in Africa longest, while other human populations lost this feature as they diverged and migrated. The genetic evidence that the San peoples represent one of the earliest diverging branches of the modern human family tree, combined with the extraordinary linguistic complexity of their click languages, does not prove that clicks were present in the original human language, but it raises the question in a way that deserves serious attention. Before addressing whether a single original language existed, the question of when language itself arose deserves examination because the timing has direct implications for how long linguistic diversification has been occurring. Language, in the fully modern sense of an open-ended combinatorial system capable of expressing any thought, is a biological capacity that depends on specific cognitive and anatomical features. A vocal tract configured for the range of sounds modern humans produce, a brain with the neural architecture supporting syntax and grammar and semantic processing, and the cognitive flexibility to use arbitrary sound-meaning pairings that can be extended infinitely through combination. The anatomical evidence for modern language capacity includes the descended larynx of modern humans, which enables the wide range of vocal sounds we produce but at the cost of making choking on food much more likely than in other primates, the shape of the hyoid bone which supports the tongue, and provides evidence of vocal tract configuration in fossil hominins, and the size and organization of the brain areas associated with language processing. Skeletal evidence suggests that the anatomical capacity for modern-style speech was present in Homo sapiens from early in our species' history, and some evidence suggests Neanderthals may also have had anatomical capacity for language, though whether their cognitive organization supported language in the full modern sense remains debated. The genetic evidence includes the FOXP2 gene, a transcription factor involved in the fine motor control necessary for speech, whose modern human variant also appears in Neanderthals, suggesting that whatever cognitive anatomical complex supports language was present in the common ancestor of modern humans and Neanderthals roughly 500,000 to 700,000 years ago.
Language
Behavioral evidence
fully present
for
from the
symbolic
beginning
thought,
of Homo
which is
sapiens
generally
or
considered
developed
a
more
prerequisite
gradually
or
across the
correlate of
species'
modern
history,
language,
is
includes shell
contested.
beads used
And
as
the answer
personal
matters
ornaments
because it
dating to
affects how
around
long linguistic
130,000 years
diversification
ago
has
in
been
North
occurring,
Africa,
and therefore
ochre with
how many
geometric
layers of
markings
change
from
separate
roughly
modern languages from
75,000
any
to
ancestral tongue.
100,000 years ago in South Africa.
The Tower of
And
Babel
the
story,
explosion of
present in the
sophisticated
Book of
symbolic
Genesis and
behavior
touching
in
on
the
similar
archaeological
themes and
record from
mythological
around
traditions from
50,000
multiple
years ago.
cultures,
Whether
represents the ancient intuition that humanity once shared a common language before being divided. Versions of this intuition appear in Sumerian mythology, in Hindu traditions, and in various indigenous oral traditions around the world, all expressing the sense that linguistic diversity is secondary, that unity was primary. Whether these parallel mythological traditions represent cultural memory of a less linguistically diverse past, or whether they simply reflect the universal human experience of encountering people who speak differently and imagining a simpler time when this was not so, is impossible to determine. But the universality of the intuition is itself interesting.
Cultures that had no contact with each other arrived at similar stories about a common origin of human language, which at minimum tells us that the question of whether we once all spoke the same tongue is one that human minds consistently ask. The scholarly history of searching for the original human language is long, occasionally brilliant, frequently misguided, and always revealing about the assumptions that investigators bring to the question. For centuries, European scholars assumed that the original language must be one of the languages they knew, with Hebrew being the most commonly proposed candidate based on its status as the language of the Old Testament. Various experiments were proposed and allegedly conducted, including the notorious claim that the Egyptian pharaoh Psamtik I ordered children raised without hearing language to see what words they would spontaneously produce, with the reported result being a word that sounded like the Phrygian word for bread, which Psamtik interpreted as evidence that Phrygian was the original language. The story is almost certainly apocryphal, and the methodology would not survive any modern ethical review board, but it illustrates how intensely the question has been pursued and how easily motivated reasoning can shape the interpretation of evidence. One of the most interesting approaches to the question of linguistic common origin comes not from historical linguistics or genetics, but from the cognitive science of language universals. Across all known human languages, certain structural features appear consistently. All languages have ways of referring to agents who perform actions. All languages have ways of indicating negation. All languages have pronouns distinguishing at minimum between self and other. All languages have ways of asking questions. All languages can express temporal relationships. All languages use contrast in sound to distinguish meaning, though the specific sounds used vary enormously. All languages have words for basic human experiences, including body parts, kinship relationships, and common perceptions. The existence of these universals does not prove a single ancestral language, because universals could arise from the universal features of human cognition and experience, rather than from common descent. All languages have words for mother not necessarily because they all descend from a single language with a word for mother, but because all human communities have mothers and human infants are cognitively primed to recognize and name their primary caregiver. The universal might be cognitive rather than historical, but the cognitive explanation and the historical explanation are not mutually exclusive. The most likely picture is that the original human language, whenever and wherever it arose, was shaped by the same universal features of human cognition that continue to shape all languages today. The original language would have had pronouns and negation and questions and tense because the humans speaking it had the same cognitive architecture as all humans who came after them. The features that appear as universals across modern languages might reflect both common descent from an ancestral language and the ongoing influence of the cognitive substrate that shaped that language to begin with. The question of whether a single original language existed intersects with a genuinely extraordinary possibility, raised by some researchers in comparative linguistics, that certain deep linguistic relationships, connections between language families separated by tens of thousands of years of divergence, might still be detectable through very careful analysis. The nostratic hypothesis, proposed by Soviet linguist Vladislav Ilyich Svitek in the 1960s and developed by several subsequent researchers, proposes that several of the major language families of Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, including Indo-European, Afro-Asiatic, Dravidian, Uralic, and others, are related through a common ancestor language called nostratic, spoken roughly 15,000 years ago. The nostratic hypothesis remains highly controversial in mainstream linguistics, with critics applying the same objections raised against proto-world. The time depth is too great for reliable reconstruction, and the similarities proposed as evidence can be explained by chance or by the limited range of sounds human languages tend to use for basic vocabulary items. The long-range comparison approach, pursued by researchers including Joseph Greenberg and Merritt Rulin in their later work, attempts to go further, looking for relationships at even greater time depths. The criticism that confronts all of these attempts is consistent. The signal-to-noise ratio in linguistic data degrades with time in ways that make reliable reconstruction increasingly questionable beyond the 8,000 to 10,000 year horizon that historical linguists conventionally accept as the practical limit of the method. What is important to recognize is that the inability to detect a relationship linguistically does not mean the relationship does not exist. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence when the evidence in question would have degraded below detectability regardless of whether the relationship is real. A single ancestral language spoken 100,000 years ago could have given rise to all modern languages. And we might have no way of detecting that relationship in the linguistic data because 100,000 years of divergence is simply too much change for the traces to survive. The genetic relationship between all humans is detectable because DNA degrades much more slowly and predictably than language. Language leaves no fossil record in the same sense. Here is the synthesis that current evidence most supports, stated as clearly as the uncertainty allows. The capacity for language is a biological feature of Homo sapiens that almost certainly arose once, in the population from which all modern humans descend, and was present in essentially its modern form by at least 50,000 to 100,000 years ago and possibly earlier. That original population living in Africa spoke some form of language. Whether it was one language or a small number of related dialects, or a collection of related languages within a relatively small interconnected population is impossible to determine. As modern humans spread out of Africa and across the planet beginning roughly 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, they took their language or languages with them. Groups that separated from each other diverged linguistically just as they diverged genetically, accumulating differences at rates that made them mutually incomprehensible within thousands of years. Groups that remained in contact maintained more linguistic connection, producing the related but distinct languages that linguists can still group into families. The 6,000 or 7,000 languages of today are the result of this process operating over tens of thousands of years, accelerated by the enormous expansion of human populations and the increasing geographic separation of groups that came with the colonization of new continents. The most linguistically diverse region of the world is sub-Saharan Africa, which is exactly what the out-of-Africa model of human origins predicts. The populations that have been in place longest have had the most time to diversify linguistically, just as they have had the most time to diversify genetically. Whether the original language of our species can be called the ancestor of all modern languages in a meaningful historical sense depends on questions about population structure and linguistic contact in early modern human Africa that are beyond what current evidence can resolve. The honest answer is that there probably was a single original human language, in the sense that language arose once in one ancestral population, but that the population speaking it was likely not perfectly homogeneous linguistically, and that the divergence from that original population was continuous and overlapping rather than being a single sudden event. The Tower of Babel story imagines a moment of sudden division, a single catastrophic fracturing of linguistic unity. The actual history, as best as we can reconstruct it, was more gradual, more continuous, and more complex. Not one moment of division, but an ongoing process of divergence that began as soon as the first humans who were separated from each other by enough distance and time started saying the same things in slightly different ways. Which, when you think about it, is what is still happening right now. Every generation changes the language they inherit in ways that their grandparents sometimes find puzzling. Every separated community develops its own slang, its own accent, its own particular ways of saying things. The process that produced 7,000 languages from one ancestral tongue is not a historical event that ended. It is a continuous process that never stopped and is happening in every community on Earth at this moment. The original human language is not lost exactly. It is still here, transformed beyond recognition into every language being spoken right now by everyone who is currently alive, because every one of those languages is its direct descendant. Which means that the thing you use to order coffee, to argue with people on the internet, to tell the people you love that you love them, is a version, changed almost beyond imagining, of the sounds that the first humans made to each other in Africa before any of this was history. That is either deeply poetic or deeply unsettling, depending on your disposition toward deep time. Both reactions, it should be said, are completely valid responses to extraordinary information.